Have you ever wondered if the avoidant in your life ever thinks about how they treated you late at night, when no one is watching, when there is no ego to protect, no image to maintain, no emotional walls to perform behind? What if the person who seemed so cold, so distant, so detached, is actually carrying a quiet, hidden shame that they would never admit out loud? This is the brutal truth that most people never hear. Avoidants are not emotionless villains. They are not robots. They are not immune to the consequences of their actions. But their shame doesn't look like tears, apologies, or vulnerability. Their shame looks like silence. It looks like emotional withdrawal. It looks like pretending they never cared at all. And if you were the one who loved deeply, who gave more, who tried to understand, this truth might shake you, because while you were questioning your worth, wondering what you did wrong, wondering why they could discard you so easily, they may have been quietly carrying a weight they didn't know how to face. The avoidant is secretly ashamed of how they treated you, not in the way you wish they were, not in the way that brings closure, but in a buried, unconscious, deeply defended way that they might not even fully understand themselves. You deserve to hear this truth. You need to understand why avoidants hurt people without even fully meaning to. From the outside, it looks calculated, selfish, cold, even cruel. But on the inside, it is often driven by fear, by confusion, by emotional shutdown patterns that formed long before you ever entered their life. Avoidants are wired to deactivate emotionally when intimacy becomes real, when love starts to feel deep, when connection starts to feel like something that could hurt them. Their nervous system doesn't interpret closeness as safety. It interprets closeness as danger. So when they feel your love, your expectations, your emotional presence, their system pulls away automatically. They distance, they detach, they rationalize, they become critical, they minimize what you shared. They rewrite the relationship in their mind to justify their withdrawal, not because you weren't valuable, but because their system doesn't know how to stay. And later, when the relationship is gone, when you are no longer asking for emotional connection, when there is no pressure, no vulnerability required, something shifts inside them. That is often when shame quietly arrives. They might remember the way you looked at them when you were confused. They might remember the messages they ignored, the affection they pushed away, the moments they shut down when you needed closeness the most. And they feel something uncomfortable, something heavy, something they don't want to sit with. But instead of facing that shame, instead of processing it, they do what they have always done. They suppress it. They detach from it. They pretend it doesn't exist. This is the inner conflict avoidants never admit. They want connection. They want love. They want to feel close to someone. But the moment they actually get it, their system panics. They feel trapped. They feel overwhelmed. They feel like they are losing themselves. So they push away the very thing they desire. And when they realize they may have hurt someone who truly cared, the shame is too painful to face directly. So they bury it under logic, under independence, under emotional distance. There is a constant war inside an avoidant. One part of them craves closeness, warmth, intimacy. Another part of them fears it with their entire being. And when that fear wins, they often behave in ways that hurt others deeply. Later, when they are alone, when they are not triggered by intimacy, when they are not being asked to open up, they can sometimes feel the emotional echo of what they lost. But they rarely share that. You need to understand the difference between guilt and shame to really grasp what is happening inside them. Guilt says, I did something wrong. Shame says, I am something wrong. Avoidants often feel shame, not guilt, and shame is paralyzing. Shame makes people withdraw. Shame makes people hide. Shame makes people avoid accountability, because facing it would mean facing their deepest fear, that they are broken, inadequate, or incapable of love. So instead of saying, I'm sorry, instead of acknowledging your pain, instead of owning their behavior, they shut down. They disappear. They move on quickly on the surface. They distract themselves, they intellectualize, they convince themselves that the relationship wasn't that important or that you were too needy, too emotional, too intense. But beneath that defense there is often a quiet, buried awareness that they didn't show up the way they could have. And that awareness hurt. To understand why this happens, you have to go back to their emotional conditioning. Many avoidants grew up in environments where emotional expression was unsafe, dismissed, or punished. Maybe they were told to be strong, maybe their caregivers were emotionally unavailable, maybe their needs were ignored or ridiculed. So they learned a simple rule: closeness equals pain, vulnerability equals danger, dependence equals weakness. As children, they survived by becoming emotionally independent. They learned to self-soothe, to shut down, to rely on themselves. That strategy protected them once. But in adult relationships, it becomes a wall that keeps love out. When you came into their life with emotional openness, affection, desire for closeness, it activated their deepest childhood conditioning. And instead of feeling safe, they felt threatened. They didn't consciously choose to hurt you. Their nervous system chose survival over connection. And yet, when they later realized that their survival strategies caused real pain to someone who cared, shame can emerge. Not in a healthy, processed way, but as a quiet, internal discomfort that they don't know how to sit with. This is why avoidants often pretend they don't care. They downplay the relationship. They act indifferent. They say things like, "It wasn't that serious," or "I'm better off alone." It's not always because they truly feel nothing. It's often because caring would require them to face their shame. Caring would require them to acknowledge that their actions had consequences. Caring would require vulnerability, so they mask. They intellectualize. They detach. They become emotionally unavailable, not just to others, but to themselves. Their defenses are sophisticated. They might joke about the relationship. They might criticize you to justify their withdrawal. They might focus on your flaws so they don't have to look at their own behavior. They might dive into work, hobbies, or new relationships to avoid introspection. But deep inside, there is often a quiet awareness that something meaningful was lost. And that awareness is heavy. You might never hear them say it. You might never receive the apology you deserved. You might never see them acknowledge the impact of their behavior. But that does not mean nothing happened inside them. It means they are still running from themselves. And here is the painful part for you. While they are suppressing their shame, you are left with the emotional aftermath. You are left questioning your worth, replaying conversations, trying to understand what went wrong. You are left carrying the emotional burden that they refuse to face. But you need to know this. Their shame is not your responsibility. Their emotional limitations are not a reflection of your value. Their inability to show up does not erase the love you offered. They may be secretly ashamed, but that shame does not heal you. It does not change what happened. It does not undo the emotional distance, the confusion, the heartbreak. It simply reveals that the story is more complex than it looked. They were not as cold as they seemed. They were not as unaffected as they acted. They were not as indifferent as you feared. They were afraid. They were conflicted. They were emotionally wounded. And instead of facing that, they ran. This is the brutal truth about avoidance. They often carry silent shame, but they rarely turn that shame into growth, accountability, or healing unless they consciously choose to do the inner work. And you deserve someone who doesn't just feel ashamed in silence, but who can love you openly, show up consistently, and take responsibility for their actions. And here is where the story becomes even more complicated. Because if avoidants feel this hidden shame, why do they still act like they don't care? Why do they still pull away, shut down, and sometimes even act cold or dismissive when you try to talk about what happened? The answer is painful, but important. Avoidants often pretend they don't care because caring feels dangerous. Caring means admitting they are emotionally invested. Caring means admitting they could be hurt. Caring means admitting they need someone. For an avoidant, needing someone feels like losing control. It feels like vulnerability. It feels like exposure, and exposure to them equals pain. So instead of saying, "I hurt you and I feel terrible about it," they put on a mask of indifference. That mask protects them from their own emotions. It protects them from feeling weak. It protects them from facing the shame they carry. They might say things like, "You're overreacting," or "It wasn't that deep," or "I'm just not that emotional." But beneath those words is often fear. Fear of intimacy, fear of being seen, fear of being responsible for someone else's heart. So they minimize, dismiss, and detach. And to you, it feels like you never mattered. But that is not the full truth. One of the most confusing parts about avoidance is the subtle signs that they actually feel ashamed, even if they never admit it. These signs are quiet, indirect, and easy to miss if you don't know what you're looking for. They might suddenly distance themselves even more after a conflict, not because they don't care, but because they feel overwhelmed by their own emotions and don't know how to handle them. They might avoid conversations about feelings or accountability because those conversations trigger their deepest insecurities. They might act overly logical, detached, or even superior when talking about the relationship because admitting emotional pain would make them feel exposed. They might rewrite the story of the relationship to make themselves feel less responsible. Sometimes they will sabotage future connections in subtle ways. They might choose emotionally unavailable partners or keep people at a distance because being close reminds them of the pain and shame they never processed. These are not excuses. These are explanations. Another painful truth is what happens after the relationship ends. While you may be grieving, processing, and trying to heal, avoidants often seem to move on quickly. They might appear fine, they might jump into something new, they might seem unaffected, but what many people don't realize is that avoidants often process loss differently. Their grief is delayed. Their emotions surface later when the threat of intimacy is gone, when there is no longer pressure to show up emotionally. Their defenses can soften just enough for feelings to surface. In quiet moments, they may replay memories. They may think about what they had. They may feel a subtle sense of regret. They may wonder if they could have handled things differently. But instead of reaching out, instead of apologizing, instead of reopening that emotional door, they often push those feelings away, because reaching out would require vulnerability. It would require facing the possibility of rejection. It would require admitting they were wrong. So they stay silent, and that silence can feel like the ultimate rejection for you. Inside an avoidant, there is often a powerful battle between ego and inner pain. Their ego wants to maintain the image of independence, strength, and emotional self-sufficiency. Their ego wants to believe they are better off alone, that relationships are unnecessary, that they are above emotional dependency. But their inner emotional self still longs for connection. It still remembers the warmth, the comfort, the closeness you offered. And when they realize they may have lost that because of their own behavior, their ego steps in to protect them from that pain. So they rationalize, they justify, they downplay, they detach. Ego says, "You didn't need them anyway." Inner pain whispers, "But they were special." That internal conflict is exhausting. And instead of resolving it, many avoidants choose denial. You might be wondering if they miss you. The answer is complicated. Avoidants often miss people in a different way than emotionally open individuals. They suppress their emotions, so their longing doesn't always feel intense in the moment. But over time, when their defenses relax, they can feel a deep sense of loss. They might miss the way you understood them, the way you accepted them, the way you offered emotional safety. But because they are trained to value independence over connection, they may interpret missing you as weakness, so they suppress it. And here is something that can be hard to accept. They may never admit this to you. They may never give you the validation you deserve. They may never say, "I treated you poorly, and I regret it." But their silence does not erase their internal experience. There is also a biological and neurological layer to this. When avoidants experience intimacy, their brain can interpret closeness as a threat. Their stress response activates, their body prepares to protect itself. This can make them feel overwhelmed, trapped or suffocated, even when the relationship is healthy. When they pull away, their nervous system calms down. Distance feels safe. Independence feels regulated. So they learn to associate detachment with relief. But later, when they are alone, their brain's bonding systems can activate. They can feel the absence of connection. They can feel loneliness. They can feel the emotional echo of what they lost. This push and pull is not just psychological, it is physiological. It is wired into their system through years of conditioning. Shame plays a powerful role in this cycle. When they realize they hurt someone, their nervous system interprets that realization as another threat. Instead of leaning into empathy and repair, they lean into avoidance and suppression. This is how the push-pull dynamic is fueled by shame. They pull away when things get close. They feel shame for pulling away. They pull away even more to avoid that shame. From your perspective, it looks like emotional whiplash. From their perspective, it feels like survival. And the most heartbreaking part is that you often become collateral damage in their internal war. You loved, you tried, you opened your heart, and they responded with distance, confusion, and emotional withdrawal. You deserved consistency. You deserved clarity. You deserved emotional safety. Instead, you got mixed signals and unanswered questions. Understanding that avoidance may feel shame doesn't erase the pain, but it can help you release the belief that you were the problem. It can help you see that their behavior was shaped by patterns that existed long before you arrived. They didn't treat you that way because you weren't enough. They treated you that way because they didn't know how to be emotionally present. And while they may secretly carry shame, that shame is theirs to process. Your healing does not depend on their awareness. Your closure does not depend on their apology. Your worth does not depend on their capacity to love. You are allowed to move forward, even if they never look back. And now we go even deeper, because what is happening inside an avoidant is not just emotional, it is neurological, psychological, and deeply ingrained. When you tried to get close, when you tried to build intimacy, when you tried to create emotional safety, their brain may have interpreted that as a threat to their autonomy. Their nervous system is often wired to equate closeness with danger. So instead of feeling comforted by your presence, they might have felt overwhelmed, trapped, or suffocated. Their body reacted before their mind could rationalize what was happening. When their stress system activates, they shut down emotionally. They detach. They create distance. They become cold, logical, and self-focused. This is not because they wanted to hurt you. It is because their system believed it needed to protect them. But here is where shame quietly enters. At some level, many avoidants are aware that their reactions are extreme. They know they hurt you. They know they withdrew when you needed closeness. They know they left you confused and emotionally alone. And when they have moments of clarity, when they are not triggered, when they are not in defensive mode, they can feel the weight of that awareness. That awareness can feel unbearable. So instead of sitting with it, instead of processing it, they push it away. They distract themselves. They avoid introspection. They convince themselves that relationships are necessary or that you were the problem. Shame becomes something they run from rather than something they heal. This is what drives the push-pull cycle. They pull away when intimacy feels overwhelming. They feel shame for pulling away. That shame makes intimacy feel even more dangerous. So they pull away again. You might have felt this cycle as sudden closeness followed by sudden distance, warmth followed by coldness, affection followed by withdrawal. To you, it felt like emotional chaos. To them, it felt like survival. But survival strategies that were useful in childhood become destructive in adult relationships. And the emotional cost is paid by both sides. One of the most painful patterns is that avoidants often avoid accountability, not because they don't know they hurt you, but because accountability would require emotional exposure. Admitting fault would mean admitting they care. Admitting fault would mean admitting vulnerability. Admitting fault would mean confronting shame directly. For someone who learned to survive by emotional self-sufficiency, that is terrifying. So instead of saying, "I'm sorry," they may say, "That's just how I am," or "You're too sensitive," or "This is why relationships don't work." These phrases are shields. They protect them from the discomfort of looking inward. But those shields cut deeply into the people who loved them. You might have waited for accountability. You might have hoped for acknowledgement. You might have wanted them to see your pain and care, and their silence or defensiveness may have felt like the ultimate invalidation. But here is the truth. Their inability to be accountable says everything about their emotional capacity and nothing about your worth. Shame also affects you in ways that are subtle but powerful. When someone you love withdraws and refuses to acknowledge the impact of their behavior, it can create deep confusion. You might question your reality. You might minimize your own pain. You might blame yourself. You might think, if they don't seem to care, maybe I'm overreacting. You might think, maybe I was too emotional. You might think, maybe I pushed them away. This is how emotional neglect can turn into self-doubt. And this is one of the most damaging effects of being with an avoidant who is not self-aware. Their unprocessed shame becomes your self-questioning. Their emotional distance becomes your anxiety. Their silence becomes your rumination. And you carry the emotional weight of something you didn't create. This is why it is so important to separate their emotional limitations from your identity. You were not too much. You were not too needy. You were not too emotional. You were human. You were attached. You were seeking connection, and that is not a flaw. Now, the question that often comes up is whether avoidants can change. Can they heal this shame? Can they become emotionally available? Can they learn to show up differently? The answer is yes, but only if they choose to. Avoidants can heal. They can develop emotional awareness. They can learn to tolerate intimacy. They can rewire their nervous system. They can process childhood wounds. They can learn to apologize, to empathize, to repair. But this requires conscious effort, therapy, self-reflection, and a willingness to feel discomfort. And many avoidants never take that path. Not because they are evil, but because facing shame is painful, and avoidance has been their lifelong coping mechanism. You cannot force someone to heal. You cannot love someone into awareness. You cannot sacrifice yourself to teach someone how to feel. Their healing is their responsibility. If you encounter an avoidant who is ashamed, who shows signs of regret, who begins to reflect, you may feel compassion. That compassion is natural. But compassion does not mean tolerating emotional unavailability. You can care about someone and still choose yourself. If an avoidant begins to show shame, it is important to maintain boundaries. Shame does not equal change. Regret does not equal growth. Awareness does not equal consistent behavior. You deserve consistent emotional presence, not just internal remorse that never becomes action. Waiting for their apology can keep you emotionally stuck. It can keep you tethered to someone who may never be able to meet you where you are. You might imagine a moment where they finally say, "I see what I did, and I'm sorry." That moment may never come, and even if it does, it may not heal the past. Closure often has to come from within. You may need to grieve, not just the relationship, but the version of them you hoped they would become. You may need to accept that their shame is real, but it is not enough. You deserve more than silent remorse. You deserve emotional reciprocity. You deserve a partner who can stay. And here is the most empowering part of this truth. Their shame does not define you. Their inability to love fully does not diminish your capacity to love deeply. In fact, your ability to feel, to attach, to care is your strength. It is what makes relationships meaningful. It is what creates intimacy. It is what allows healing. You are not broken for wanting connection. You are not weak for feeling deeply. You are not wrong for expecting emotional presence. They may be secretly ashamed, but you are openly worthy. And whether they ever face that shame or continue to run from it, you have the power to move forward, to heal and to build connections with people who are emotionally available. You are allowed to choose love that chooses you back. And now, we arrive at the most important part of this truth, the part that is not about them anymore. It is about you. Because once you understand that avoidance may feel shame, may feel regret, may even miss you in their own silent way, the real question becomes, what do you do with that knowledge? Can avoidants truly change and heal their shame? Yes, they can, but only when they choose to confront what they have spent their entire life avoiding, their emotions. Healing for an avoidant is not just reading a book or watching a video. It is learning to sit with discomfort instead of running from it. It is learning to feel instead of shutting down. It is learning to communicate instead of disappearing. It is learning to stay instead of pulling away. It requires therapy, self-awareness, emotional practice, and a willingness to feel vulnerable. It requires rewiring a nervous system that learned love was dangerous. It requires facing childhood wounds, attachment trauma, and deeply buried beliefs about independence and connection. Some avoidants do this work, many do not. And that is where your responsibility to yourself begins. When an avoidant starts to feel ashamed, you might feel hope, you might feel compassion, you might think, maybe this time they'll change. But shame alone does not create transformation. Shame without action often creates more avoidance, more silence, more emotional walls. So what should you do if an avoidant feels ashamed? You create boundaries. You step back from rescuing. You step back from explaining, you step back from carrying their emotional burden. You can acknowledge their humanity without sacrificing your well-being. You can understand their wounds without allowing those wounds to wound you again. You are not their therapist. You are not their healer. You are not responsible for their emotional growth. Your responsibility is to yourself. This is why waiting for their apology can be one of the most painful traps. You might replay conversations in your mind, imagining what they would say if they truly understood your pain. You might fantasize about closure, about validation, about hearing them admit they were wrong, but waiting for that moment can keep you emotionally tethered to someone who may never give it. Avoidants often process shame privately. They often keep remorse internal. They often choose silence over vulnerability, and even if they feel it deeply, they may never express it. So if your healing depends on their apology, you may remain stuck in their emotional orbit long after the relationship has ended. You deserve freedom from that. Closure does not have to come from them. Validation does not have to come from them. Peace does not have to come from them. You can create it within yourself. You can acknowledge your pain, your love, your effort, your heartbreak, and honor it without their recognition. And here is where their shame can become your empowerment. Understanding their emotional limitations can release you from self-blame. It can help you stop asking, what was wrong with me, and start asking, what was wrong with the dynamic. You can see that their inability to show up was not a reflection of your value, but a reflection of their emotional capacity. You can stop chasing validation from someone who could not give it. You can stop replaying moments, trying to find the mistake that made them pull away. You can stop shrinking yourself to fit into their emotional comfort zone. You are allowed to expand. You are allowed to feel deeply. You are allowed to want intimacy, consistency, and emotional presence. Their shame does not erase the fact that you deserved better. Their regret does not change the fact that they did not show up. Their internal pain does not excuse the pain they caused. You can hold compassion and boundaries at the same time. You can say, I understand why you are the way you are, and still say, I choose not to be in this dynamic. You can see their wounds and still choose your healing. And now I want to speak directly to the part of you that felt discarded, confused, and emotionally abandoned. You were not unlovable. You were not forgettable. You were not insignificant. You were with someone who did not know how to stay emotionally present. Their avoidance was about their nervous system, their conditioning, their fears, their internal conflict. It was not about your worth. They may be secretly ashamed of how they treated you. They may replay moments in their mind, They may feel regret in quiet, private ways. But whether they do or not, your story does not end with their awareness. Your story continues with your healing. You get to rebuild trust in yourself. You get to reconnect with your emotional needs. You get to choose partners who are emotionally available. You get to create relationships where closeness feels safe, not threatening. You do not have to become avoidant to survive avoidance. You do not have to shut down your heart because someone else could not open theirs. Your sensitivity is not a weakness. Your attachment is not a flaw. Your desire for connection is not something to be ashamed of. If anything, it is a sign of emotional health. So, let them carry their shame. Let them process it in silence if they choose. Let them run from it if they must. But do not carry it for them. You are not responsible for their emotional journey. You are responsible for your own, and your journey leads towards self-worth, clarity, emotional safety, and love that does not disappear when things get real. You were not the problem. You were the one who showed up. You were the one who felt. You were the one who tried. And that makes you powerful. If this message resonated with you, if you've experienced the confusing, painful dynamic of loving someone who could not fully love back, know that you are not alone. Your experience is real, your feelings are valid, and your healing is possible. You deserve a love that stays. You deserve a partner who chooses you openly. You deserve emotional presence, not emotional distance. And whether the avoidant ever faces their shame or continues to avoid it, you are free to move forward, to heal, and to create the connection you always deserved.